Cara,
Boa noite, eu sou
Good
Paulo Roberto.
evening. My name is Paulo Roberto Pires. I am chief editor of Serrote magazine, and it is a pleasure to welcome here for the 5th edition of the Serrote Festival. We are launching number 40 of our magazine, 40th edition. And for 2 years now, these conversations have been taking place remotely. We really miss the in-person meetings, the live Serrote, as we call them, which we love to do. But the world has changed, and we have to reflect about this very dense and complex reality of a pandemic, a war, and the extreme right, which is a cause for worry and which we always fight against. This year, we have here with us Professor Hartmann, who will be with you in a couple of minutes. And tomorrow, we will have Igor Rainer, Noemi Jaffe, and Marcos Queiroz, also our guests. We will have Jefferson Barbosa, and today, Stephanie Borges is going to moderate this conversation with Professor Hartmann. But before I introduce Stephanie, I would like to let you know that we have simultaneous interpretation from Beatriz Veloso and Lara Moamar, and we have also sign language interpreters, Grace Albuquerque and Erika Mota. We have 2 different streams on YouTube, one with simultaneous translation into Portuguese, and another with the original English audio for your choice. We will have an event that will last for about 1 hour, and it will then be available at our YouTube channel. You can ask your questions through the chat box on YouTube. Please feel free to ask your questions and send your comments. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Stephanie Borges, who is a translator, a poet, the author of a very special book that it's called Talvez Precisemos de nome para isso. We might need a name for that in Portuguese. And Serrote has published many of her essays and translations. And now we have just published her translation of an essay by Professor Hartmann. I give the floor to Stephanie, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Good evening, Paulo. Thank you very much for inviting me to translate this essay that will be the subject of our conversation today, but also for the possibility of being here for this conversation. Before we begin, I was asked to make a brief audio description of me for accessibility purposes. For people who can only listen to us, I am a Black woman with short hair, short curly hair, dark brown, almost black hair. To the length of my ears, I am wearing a blue and white dress and a red lipstick, which is one of my trademarks. And now, speaking about our guest, Professor Hartmann is one of the main references, contemporary references in African American studies. She's a professor of English and compared literature at the Columbia University. In 2019, she received a Genius Grant from the McCarthy Foundation. Grant given to academics that highlight in their fields of action and of study. We are seeing the work of Professor Hartmann finally being published in Brazil, which is very fortunate for us. We have The End of White Supremacy, which is an essay. It was published by Fósforo Editora, together with a tale written by Du Bois. And we also have Venus in Two Acts, published in an anthology called Pensamento Negro Radical, Black Radical Thought, that brings together many Black thinkers, and I highly recommend this book. We have the book Lose Your Mother, which was published by Bazar do Tempo, and we are waiting anxiously for the publication of Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, who is already on pre-sale. And also Scenes of Subjection, which is her first book. These books will soon be joined by the publication of The Plot of Her Undoing, which will be published in the next number of Serrote magazine. Before we begin this conversation and before we hear our guest, which is what interests us today, I'm going to read a couple of lines of this essay to you, The Plot of Her Undoing. If you haven't read Professor Hartmann's work yet, it brings together many aspects of her work that mix a dense historic research and also an extremely cared for prose. And I think that the best way to invite you to read and to be part of today's conversation is to hear a bit of what she writes if you haven't received the magazine yet. The Plot of Her Undoing. The plot of her undoing begins with his dominion. It begins in the 15th century with a papal bull, with a philosopher at his desk, pen in hand, as he sorts the world into categories of genus and species. It begins with a bill of sale, with a story in the newspaper that enumerates her crimes, with a note appended to the file. She answers questions easily, but appears stupid. It begins with a wanted poster that reduces the history of her life to a single word: condemned. The plot of her undoing begins with a man in his study, writing a tome about the Americas, the species, the fauna, the races. It is a compendium illustrated with botanical drawings, architectural plans, sketches of farm buildings, and a microscopic view of her scarf skin. The plot of her undoing begins with the violence of reason. And, after reading just these few lines, I would like to begin by asking, as a poet, I think this is maybe an unescapable question. How did you come to the form of this essay that keeps repeating all these elements and aspects of the plot, of this plot that is attacking a free Black woman? Can you tell us a bit about this?
I think I was thinking about our current crisis on multiple levels, from racist state violence against Black people to the climate crisis to the most predatory forms of capitalism, and this Black female figure was the focal point for that. And I was thinking a lot about the philosophers who dreamed the order, who gave us our vocabulary of being, of rights, of goodness, and how that project, was contaminated from the very beginning. And so I had one particular man of enlightenment in mind, but that man in his study was replicated throughout the West and the Americas. So the repetition was about trying to just build on all of the layers of the experience and thinking that even as it's focalized through a Black female figure, that it's really kind of telling this global story, a global story that's about capitalism, that's about enclosure, that's about the birth of, a racial order, that's about the enclosure of, of the female, of woman as wife and as property. So I think that my screed needed a certain kind of rhythm. And so thus the use of repetition to structure it.
E, assim, é ensaio que, embora a gente...
This is an essay, although we do realize it's very much centered around the experience of Black women. As the episodes that are told, as they appear, we realize that there is a broader observation. So you speak about the expulsion of indigenous people, of colonial wars, of the sharing of the African territories between Europeans. So there is this movement that begins with Enlightenment when, this hierarchy is created, this whiteness hierarchy is created, classifying and rating other lives. But we also see that this is not just limited to Black lives. I believe an important reading of your essay is to realize that this plot, it's not just about racism. It has branches that reach several different aspects and that also impact other people who are not necessarily only white women. What do you think about this?
I think that's a really important point because often, we get the universal category woman, but usually woman, as is articulated as a universal ideal, is totally racialized. It's in the unmarked category of white woman. And here I wanted to really think about entanglement. So even as it's focalized through a Black female figure, they're indigenous figures, they're figures at the border, they're figures in internment camps, they're figures in Palestine. So I wanted to, to kind of illuminate all of the ways in which these histories of dispossession are totally entangled. Even as they are distinct, they are entangled, and they are the consequence of a particular kind of settler, colonial, racial, and capitalist formation. So how could I attend to the, particularity, but also articulate the structure as a whole. And it was very important to do that. The essay was written for, it was written as a kind of a feminist manifesto, and it was a feminist manifesto. These manifestos were all produced under the former, president. We just say 45. We don't even call his name. And so what did we need at that point? We needed a statement that says, listen, the same order is killing all of us, right? So the plot was supposed to make that clear and then issue a call, It's both about her undoing, but also how is it that we might undo and undo together.
Sim, o texto vai fazendo...
Yes, indeed, the text really draws or creates this movement, between specific situations of the lives of Black women, but also touches on broader issues. It talks about legislation such as the segregation legislation in the US. It talks about injustices connected to lending opportunities, student loans, or opportunities of access to public health services, upward mobility opportunities. And this is not just restricted to Black people. We see that injustices, both here in Brazil and in the US as well, they, of course, have this very strong racial element. But when we think about this moment in which we live of a rise of fascist movements, we realize that it's not just for us. Maybe we are the people who are warning others for longer about these dangers. But these are problems that are much broader. Can you comment a bit on that?
I mean, I would agree. I think that, I mean, just like the global housing crisis, for example, the gentrification of cities, which is making just kind of like life impossible for people all over the world in these, metropolitan areas, thinking about surveillance capitalism, thinking about the quote unquote Anthropocene. And, again, it's about thinking about the historical formation. But for me, I guess what I would say, and that's really important, I mean, usually when we think about, say something like a Black feminist politics, we think like, oh, that there are these other categories which are so much broader than like a Black feminist politics. And that would be, the climate crisis or, capitalism or all of these other things. And for me, my goal was to like articulate all of those questions explicitly as a Black feminist project, right? So it's not that that project in any narrow way concerns, just like Black women in their lives. It can, it's about this world, right? The terms of order that, that govern us, and that project wants to interrogate and displace those terms. And the impact of that displacement will affect everyone, right? So it's not simply like, oh, as Black women, can we simply be included in the project of like neoliberal capitalism? Can we have our rights in our own little, all the goodies that come from inequality, but understanding like, oh yes, our dispossession in a certain way is very representative, and undoing that dispossession makes so much possible for so many people. In the US, there's this saying about Black people, a canary in the coal mine, meaning that that Black people often experience a dimension of a social crisis first and most acutely, but then that social crisis engulfs the rest. And I think that, even someone like, a philosopher like Achille Mbembe would say like, oh, at one time, only Black people's lives were fungible. Now that fungibility is becoming a global condition. So that was exactly that, the kind of the cross-hatching I was working, the particularity of the Black female or Black femme position, and the assumption of all the ways in which that's limited and minor and contained, and instead it becomes the vehicle for this really, robust and, proliferating radical project, whether that project is in South Africa or Palestine or Brooklyn or London, so that was the spirit of it.
Conceito que o Achille Mbembe chama de...
This is a concept Achille Mbembe calls the future, the Black future of the world. So the precarization of the lives of people in this neoliberal project that is spreading out to all different lives. And I wanted to change gears just a little bit now because there is an aspect that moves me specifically or particularly in your work. Although you work with archives and you work with very difficult stories and violent reports or the erasing of a dignified life for Black people, your work always asks us to think about freedom. And in this essay, The Plot of Her Undoing, there is something that seems very subtle to me, which is the plot to undo the Black woman is not just something economic or financial or just the most obvious type of violence. It is also connected to subjective controls. So there is the control of desire, there is marriage, reproductive control, there is this imposition of monogamy or of a specific way of having relationships. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about this, because when we speak about freedom, it's also very important to talk about these aspects that are not just the freedom of our lives in terms of the opportunities and possibilities, but also freeing our imagination. And I think this is a part of the essay that is really in connection with your book, Wayward Lives. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about this, please.
And I guess this is where, you know, the mark of these like anarchist feminists and others are there, because, you know, that freedom of intimate life, that freedom to escape a certain script of heteronormativity or the marriage plot, you know, is also part of it, right? It's kind of free from a certain organization of subjectivity, right? Which is as much a political text as anything else. And I really like the work of the, you know, Marxist feminist Silvia Federici. And, you know, in her work, she really makes apparent how, like when we think about, you know, the enclosure, it's the enclosure of property on every level, from the transformation of earth into alienable land, and from, you know, the transformation of, you know, female life into categories of, you know, wife, concubine, property, and, you know, commodified beings. So, you know, when many feminists have articulated a notion of the general strike as the reconstruction of everything, and I take that quite seriously. And you're right to connect it with, you know, Wayward Lives, because partly what's often the case with, you know, women who are considered troublesome or rebellious or you know, defiant, women who are often the target of the state's violence and criminalization. It's not that they're, you know, simply asking for freedom in terms of, you know, a political project, like, oh, the right to vote, the right to kind of earn equal wages, et cetera. They're, you know, they're saying like, no, we want, you know, kind of an end to an economy of extraction and exploitation. We want, you know, an end to the organization of our lives along certain lines. We want reproductive freedom, right? Which is just not about, you know, the right to abortion. It's also about, you know, the right for our children to live. So partly what, you know, the female at the center of the plot is doing, again, is articulating all of those levels, from, you know, the date rape in your college dorm room, you know, to the politics of extraction, right? And I think that for leftist feminists, Black feminists, we have understood very, you know, intimately the way racial capitalism inhabits our body and extracts and steals our capacity. And those capacities are just not about laboring in the world. Those are about our intimate capacities, you know, commanding our care, commanding our love, right? We think of, you know, about the work of the nanny. What is the nanny required to do? It's just not to appear to, show up at a door and like, walk a child to school, but it is to love, it is to care, it is to give everything of oneself for a totally low wage. So that's the way in which all of the dimensions of intimate life, from the command of care to the restriction of a certain kind of love plot, are at the center of The Undoing. And I hope I'm not too long-winded, Stephanie. You'll have to reel me in if I go on.
Pode deixar, mas nós estamos muito felizes de
We are
poder.
actually extremely happy to have the opportunity to hear you.
Eu gosto muito desse
I am very fond of this topic of subjective freedom, subjective liberties, and the choices and the arrangements, the plots that are unconventional. I would also like to talk about Wayward Lives, if we may, because it is somewhat different from Losing a Mother, a book that is already available, Lose Your Mother. It's available, it's been translated to Portuguese. In this book, you've actually researched a latest archive, the Black neighborhoods of New York and Philadelphia in, the late 19th and early 20th century. One of the key differences is that there's a reflection on photography in the book, which is extremely powerful because this archive contains some images, but at the same time, these are challenging images, not only because of how the body of the women are depicted, but also in terms of how they are looking into the camera, maybe because they don't want to be photographed in that particular way. Can you maybe elaborate what the experience was like to work with this photographic archive?
Yes, it was a varied archive, and so there are a range of photographs in it. When I first started the project, I was really interested in photographs that were more about like self-fashioning and how people came to understand themselves as like free subjects in the world of, in the more immediate aftermath of the formal abolition of slavery. And but the book really started when I encountered a nude photograph taken of a young Black girl, be anywhere between the ages of 10 and 12, and I was, by a famous artist, and really thinking about, how was it that young girl was photographed in the artist's studio? What circumstances, positioned her there, and the kind of jeopardy she might have been in. And so there was one way that people read the photograph. It's a classic nude. It's the odalisque. So it's the reclining female nude that's very popular in painting and in kind of Western art history. And they described it as sexy. They described it as alluring, as pornographic. And I just saw a compelled image of violence. So for me, in reading that photograph, what I wanted to do was both, in a way, protect the young girl who had been disrobed for the photograph. And I also wanted to radically recaption it. So rather than it being about, a kind of, seductive young negress, I wanted to think about the circumstances that positioned that young girl there. So that's one kind of image. There are also other compelled images in the book. There's, an image taken of a young Black woman in prison. But then there's a radically different archive of images. There are images that are taken of, young women and queer men that are about this kind of self-elaboration, that are about the ways in which, even in the most horrific and horrible circumstances, there is still, the premium that's placed on beauty and possibility. And so I wanted the photographs to do all of that. The photographs to both, illuminate the violence and precarity that still characterize Black lives, to think about this new formation that would contain Black life, which was the urban ghetto, but to also think about, possibility, because even as, 20th century reformers scolded, young Black men and women, they scolded them for an excess love of beauty. They scolded them for being aesthetical. They scolded them for being poor, but like spending their money on beautiful clothes. And that for me was, this articulation of possibility, of beauty, of longing, even in a situation characterized by oppression, by deprivation, by racial containment.
Nós temos uma pensadora brasileira muito
There's a
importante.
very important Brazilian thinker, Leda Maria Martins. I remembered her while I was reading your book, in that, yes, creating beauty amidst a precarious life. She states that many African peoples, mainly those that were brought to Brazil as the Yorubais, they believe that Black life is an aesthetic experience. No matter where the Black person is, whether it's a tenement, a slum, this person will always strive to create beauty for him or herself, to actually feel pleasure, some pleasure whatsoever from the situation. There's a spiritual aspect related to this kind of self-care. And in the book, well, there are striking chapters. I was also struck when I came across two Black intellectuals that are very important in your anonymous figure archives, because you actually work with these figures that either were forgotten or are treated as merchandise, as goods, as criminals. But in this book, there's a chapter that focuses on I.W. Wells, top journalist and activist. She fought against lynching. And then you have Du Bois, also top intellectual and a very important sociologist. How did they come into your research this time around?
Yeah. Well, Du Bois is always, he's the foundation, and the way Ida B. Wells is. I mean, I think that once I saw the photograph of, of the young girl in that Philadelphia studio, I said, oh, I have to reread The Philadelphia Negro. And then I thought, like, wow, wouldn't it be amazing for her and Du Bois to kind of encounter one another, because much of what he was studying in The Philadelphia Negro was precisely the kind of problems that make, young Black women vulnerable to, to sexual violence, sexual exploitation. And so then I thought, like, oh, I want to somehow imagine their paths crossing. So then Du Bois really became a character. And, while Du Bois is, a totally, foundational individual, I mean, many of the strategies of Du Bois and of the NAACP, particularly in terms of like their anti-lynching strategies, were borrowed directly from Ida B. Wells. Du Bois and others found Ida B. Wells to be a troublesome woman. So they essentially tried to, in a way, like write her out of history. They borrowed her strategies without giving her any credit. And Ida B. Wells was so she was just so fierce and so courageous. I mean, so one, she loved fashion. So she's on the train, you know, in her lovely linen duster, and she's sitting in a first class seat. And when the white conductor says, I mean, it's fine for her to be there as long as they assume that she's a maid traveling with one of the white women in the car. But when they realize that she's there on her own, they're like, you have to leave. And she's like, I'm not going to leave. And then she holds onto her seat. The conductor tries to pull her out. She kicks him. It takes like 4 men to drag her out of the car. And as a Black woman to do that in the 19th century, I mean, she was fully aware she could have lost her life as a result of such resistance, right? So it's not a small thing. I mean, she literally was constantly risking her life for her principle. And she was just really courageous and dared to say things that, you know, that no one else dared to say because they were so enraging to white racists. And so I wanted her to be there because both as this like Black feminist icon and as, you know, just as an example of fierceness. In a way, she too is wayward, right? She's stepping out of, you know, the parameters of the expected. She's a radical intellectual. She's, you know, giving her opinions even when they're not welcome. And she actually writes her autobiography towards the end of her life because she understands that these men have tried to write me out of history. I'm not going to let them succeed in doing that. So I'm going to write an autobiography to, you know, to keep my place, to document my own history, and really to kind of like archive my practice. And in that way, she was, you know, undefeated, just brilliant, relentless, and never stopped doing what she needed to do, even as she was marginalized by a traditional race leadership.
Nós começamos a receber
We
perguntas.
have, well, questions are coming in now from our participants, so maybe I can ask you some of the questions that just came in. The first question is from Fernanda Silva e Souza, who actually signed the forward from Lose Your Mother, and she asks the following. Besides your dialogue with photography, in Wayward Lives, there is a relation with music, especially with the ideas of chorus and refrain. How does Black music influence your reflection and also your writing?
No, that's a great question. I mean, I think that, you know, I should say one that even as I'm involved in this process of historical research, I want the work to read like a novel. And I'm always involved in writing a history of the present. So writing about, you know, this quote unquote past as it speaks to and articulates issues that are, you know, central and critical to our time. And partly there's narrative that's built on music. And some readers have observed there's certain kind of anachronistic samplings of song lines and lyrics. And partly that's to give the work the kind of the flavor of the present, so that you can still hear like urban idioms from the 21st century as they meet those idioms of the early 20th century. That music is a really important locus of the collective voice and of collective memory. And I think that the chorus was so important not only kind of literally the chorus, because for Black working women, if you were not educated, there were kind of like, you know, you could become a domestic, you were educated, you can become a teacher, or if you were lucky and you had a little talent, then maybe you could, you know, join a chorus. Maybe you could be a musical star or a dancer. For me, you know, the chorus is, you know, very much also informed by, you know, the Greek chorus, and thinking about in terms of histories of Black radicalism, in terms of histories of slave rebellion, those stories are usually focused and predicated upon, you know, the tragic hero, right? A brilliant example is David Scott's Conscripts of Modernity, thinking about a figure like, you know, Toussaint Louverture as, you know, as a Black Enlightenment figure. But the chorus is always there, right? So the chorus actually carries the story. The chorus provides the space for the quote unquote hero to articulate his account. And I thought, what happens if we, though, like focus on the chorus, right? And we know that before, you know, kind of Greek drama evolved to the more kind of like formal later Greek tragedy, that the early tragedies, they were basically choreo poems. So they were song and dance, and the chorus was really, really central in that. So that also seemed like a really important figure for transforming the way we think about Black political struggle, right? So rather than the charismatic, you know, leader, rather than the kind of, you know, the tragic hero or the great man, let's think about the chorus. Let's think about the, you know, the ensemble. Often they're nameless, right? But they actually make social movements. They bring them to fruition. They actualize their goals. Again, another important text for me was C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins. And, you know, in that text, C.L.R. James talks about, you know, the culture of Vodou and the Vodun songs that were so important, but how do we translate those songs into a political idiom that's legible in the West? It's almost like impossible to, right? But yet that chorus, those Haitian masses, those were the people who actually made good the Haitian Revolution. And so the chorus for me is that vehicle. It's the vehicle of the unnamed multitude who animate social struggle, who articulate collective aspirations, and who are always, you know, the bodies in the street that make change.
Essa resposta é muito importante.
Your answer, what you just said, is very important for us to go back to the essay. Although the essay is very much centered around all these movements, colonialism, white supremacy, anti-Black racism, that plot against Black women, late in the essay, we also have the question of how to undo the plot. And many people who are here would maybe like to hear a bit about this. And you were just talking about the core, the Greek core or the core. And it came to me the idea, because in the text it says that the undoing of the plot is a discrete action or proceeds by stealth, as you call them, small actions which are not perceptible, subtle movements. And when we stop to think about social movements, and mostly Black movements, we are talking about a collective which is operating in different fronts, with different priorities, but that somehow are fighting against this plot, maybe, you know, doing little sabotages or booby traps, you know, acting in the edges, I would say. And I think it's important maybe to think about the corps or the music corps in which we have different types of voices, different singers, each one acting, in a different position. I think that's a good image to think about other structures of political fight. Not everyone needs to want to be a hero or a protagonist, but we need everyone singing together to reach harmony. Can you comment a bit of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, I think there are many answers because, on the one hand, these, stealth acts are very important. The, acts on multiple front by these decentered groups. I mean, I was actually thinking, because the second half of the essay, it talks about them like, gathering at the river. And I was thinking of, someone like, Harriet Tubman gathering enslaved people at the river and, guiding them to freedom. I was thinking about, the Combahee River Collective, a really important collective of Black feminists who named themselves after, Tubman gathering at that river in the struggle against slavery. And I guess when we think about Black people and abolition, certainly, and the end of slavery, the formal end of slavery, at least in the U.S., so much of it had to do with what Du Bois called the general strike. And what that was hundreds of thousands of Black people left the plantation. They ran away. It wasn't a mass movement at all. It was like small groups, individual little clusters of people just running away constantly. Yet that, but when we think about that action collectively, it produced this thing that we now understand called the general strike that significantly weakened the South and, and crippled agricultural production. So again, it wasn't that there was a leader who, reached out to hundreds of thousands of people and said, now leave. There was an opening that was created, and many enslaved people took advantage of that, and they dealt the plantation a decisive blow. They refused slavery in its own terms. And I think, the other side of it is like, when we think about, like the massive, really important, so just really, just booing demonstrations of 2020 against racism, against police violence, against all of that by the movement for Black lives, which was critically important. When we look at least in the US, the results of all of that massive mobilization hasn't been, in fact, it hasn't culminated in defunding the police. Across the board, the funding for the police has only increased. So there's this kind of like paradox. So we have this like fabulous, mass movement that has as its goal defunding. What is the response to that massive movement actually produces the opposite effect. And I think that's why we need multiple strategies on multiple fronts. And I think partly from, refusing to be conscripted, to certain, plots of the subject, and as well as kind of, collective action, as well as, massive campaigns. All those levels. I think that we understand the massive movement as a kind of politics. I think that we don't understand the kind of those smaller gestures, those forms of everyday sabotage, these kind of like decentered anarchist acts. We tend not to understand that as constituting a radical politics. So that's what I try to illuminate in the work.
Nós temos aqui uma outra pergunta.
We have another question that we received from our audience, from Marco Túlio. And he would like to know if the ideas of Afro-pessimism and Afrofuturism have an impact in your writing or in your research somehow?
E como você enxerga o
And
futuro?
how do you see the future for Black bodies?
I would say I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what the future holds for humans on planet Earth. It seems like that's an open question. I think that what I like about the question is the way it assumes a kind of dialogue between Afro-pessimism and Afrofuturism, or Afro-pessimism and Black optimism. And, I think that many people, say that, we're really just kind of, in this kind of, shared fight to defeat these structures that make life so impossible and so unlivable. My intellectual formation was very much under, kind of like, Marxist trained from like, Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, so someone like Hazel Carby, Stuart Hall. So as a student, I was very much, walking around with that, Gramscian slogan in my head about, the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. And so I think that in a way, I think that there's a lot that we need to do as intellectuals, as thinkers, and partly that is a kind of, a critical engagement and disenchantment of, this brutal world that we're in, and that it's not the only possibility of, human existence. It's not the only possibility of dwelling on the planet. And I think that that's where a kind of like intellectual pessimism is really important, because it can, denaturalize these structures. There's nothing natural or inevitable about the social order in which we find ourselves. And I think that, again, I think that probably the future for me is about acting in the now, acting in ways that produce, alternative modalities for social existence, reducing carbon footprints, reducing the harm we do. I mean, that's how I tend to think about it. I mean, I think that I think that the thing about the future is that it's neither to be taken for granted nor imagined as just more of the same. We know we need a break from this order of man. What that will be, will it be the emergence of, a context in which, all modes of life can thrive? Or will that break just be like, the end of man and the end of a kind of a human order because of the incredible devastation and violence that we, have wrought on the planet? I don't know. That's why I'm a historical thinker. I try to make sense of the present by looking at what people have done. But I think that there are many really brilliant people who are thinking about these issues, speculative theorists and speculative writers who are trying to imagine ways out and ways onto something better.
Bom, eu acho que esse ensaio, a trama para acabar
This
com ela,
essay, the plot of Her Undoing, shows in a very subtle way how things are not natural, how they are determined, by scientific treaties, legislations, the institution of a specific type of medical knowledge, the way the financial system is structured. All of that is human doings. This was done by humans. And at the same time, it happens in a subtle way. Your essay is relatively short, and it lists, in a sense, different examples of things that happen and have an impact in the lives of people. There's also something which I think it's important to mention. You said that you write and you want to be read as a novelist or as a novel, which is completely possible because your prose is just so fluid. I was completely, enchanted by the characters in Wayward Lives. I was curious and I wanted to know more. And I think it's also a matter of how stories or specific stories are brought up. We have a question coming from Marcia, and she says, I believe that while we have racism in our society, it will be necessary to repeat and slavery narratives and colonization strategies as a fight strategy. But how can we speak about our story, the Black history? How can we denounce anti-Black violence without keep on hurting again and again Black bodies? Is that possible?
Yeah, and if I understand it correctly, I mean, I think the question is like, how do we tell these stories, these histories without subjecting Black people to violence again in the telling? Is that it? Yeah.
É isso mesmo.
That's exactly the question, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's really critical for me, and it's been, critical for me ever since, Scenes of Subjection. And how do we actually give an account of violence without reproducing its modalities, without, re-traumatizing Black people, without, just kind of replicating it. And I think that there was a strategy used by, 18th and 19th century abolitionists and humanitarians that, has yet to be exhausted. And that is just the kind of, the spectacle of Black pain and death as, as a vehicle for white pedagogy, right? Like, so, if people actually see, the extent of this violation, well, then won't things, change? And in fact, we know the answer to that is no. No. And so I think that there is a way that we can, contend and represent the enormity of this violence without making Black folks kind of, carry all the weight of it, and without just kind of re-violating people. I think that that's part of our work as thinkers, as poets, as historians, and as novelists to account for these structures, but not, through some shorthand where we just, see violated Black bodies. So no, I think that it would be a huge problem.
Bom, eu acho que vale recomendar para Márcia.
I want to recommend to Marcia, the person who asked the question, Venus in Two Acts, the essay that brings a reflection about how we can build a narrative of a violent scene without necessarily violating the victim, and a reflection about all these implications. How do we decide to tell? What should we tell and how? I would like to
Can I say one
go
more?
back.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just in relationship to,
Claro.
Venus in Two Acts. I mean, because someone said, well, so, are you just creating another subject for the law and trying to like tell Venus's story? And I was like, no, I'm trying to rescue this life that's already been created as a subject of the law. So how do I respect what it is I can't know, but also attend to and amplify what I do, but without resubjecting her to, the violence that consigned her to death.
Porque eu queria aproveitar, já que
Yes,
nós
and I wanted to take advantage of the fact that we are reflecting on how to tell. And when we think about wayward lives, there is, a questioning of institutional violence. And I think this is really important since we are talking about how to tell stories without falling back again into this pedagogy through suffrage or suffering. Characters do go through difficult things. One goes into an institution, she loses her children, and another one is in a lynching crowd. She's attacked by a police officer. Bad things happen. However, the stories are treated from different perspectives that question, why was the police officer arresting a woman as a prostitute just because she was standing in a corner? Why a single mother who was left by the father of her child is treated as a delinquent? So I think it's also a displacement of where does the violence come from and how it impacts the lives of people. Could you comment a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, partly there was the assumption, and this happened, often, just like a Black woman in public space is assumed to be a prostitute. So there's nothing, and even as she's actually waiting for her husband to exit a saloon, it's like, oh, the assumption is, that she's a prostitute. The assumption is that Black people are criminals, so that before anything can happen, the structure seizes you, right? It fixes you as, a transgressor of law, as a potential, criminal. And I think that, one thing that's actually just like so true, and another, part of the book, we have a story of like, there were these things called no-knock warrants. Police officers could just enter your apartment, no warrant, and arrest whoever was there. Breonna Taylor was murdered by the police under the same exact kind of warrant. It's called, a no-knock warrant, right? You just enter a house, and then, often police officers, not in any kind of uniform, armed men enter your house, and you're supposed to do what? And so I think that it's the understanding that, conditions of reception, like, oh, that fundamentally Blackness is equivalent to criminality. And that equation then is going to determine how Black people are encountered in public space. And that's what we see with the race riot in New York in 1900. And that's what we see later on when, even like, a very like wealthy actress in her home is arrested for being a prostitute. I mean, she's making at the time tons of money. She's totally successful, right? But the only assumption is that like, oh, she must be a prostitute. That's how the state sees her. And then for any form of intimacy that's outside, the hetero married norm is also assumed to be criminal and to be deviant.
Uma coisa que eu acho.
And there's something that would also be really important to mention, which is there's a complexity to your work that consists of observing the traps that come up or are placed for Black people. So we're talking about, this intimacy that is not regulated by the state, or maybe about the idea of crime. And this has also caused for an idea to arise according to which there is a right way to be Black by copying the way of life of the white. that is a bourgeois life, pursuing policies that have to do with respectability, and in Wayward Lives, or rather the plot of Her Undoing arises at, or has to do with the gatekeepers, who's actually Black, who's actually to define. In Wayward Lives, it happens with some of the dwellers in the tenement. Can you also talk about how or what it is like to understand or grasp these situations like that? Many people have actually come across these situations, acquaintances, family members, and to those of us who are interested in radical policy, how can we actually try to shy away from those traps?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge, because I think that particularly at the beginning of the 20th century, we're only, like 4 decades out of slavery. And so it is assumed that, we, prove that we are worthy of equality by mimicking the way, bourgeois white people live. Like, that's how we'll be able to prove that we're equal and we're deserving of rights. Of course, there's a radically different social text created by hundreds of years of enslavement. There's a different cultural text. There are different values, right? So basically, rather than, than just embracing what those other modes of life are, they are deemed to be, like deviant or variant or dangerous. But that politics of respectability, is still a very dominant thematic in Black politics. I mean, we might think about, President Obama talking about cousin Pookie, right? And, and cousin Pookie is, your wayward cousin who needs to like do better and pull his pants up, right? So that there's still these efforts to, police Black life. I mean, in the book, I described this, a sex party that happens at the house of a Harlem heiress, A'Lelia Walker, daughter of Madam C.J. Walker, the first Black woman millionaire. She invented the comb that would straighten your hair. And so she has this sex party in her lovely Harlem apartment. And one of the women I, write about, queer Mabel Hampton, queer gender nonconforming, attends this party. A'Lelia's great granddaughter was outraged that her great grandmother appeared in the book that way. I mean, I didn't make it up. It was reported in, this oral history. But that's to say, we're still so concerned about, respectability. And I received a letter from a man who had read an excerpt from Wayward Lives in the New Yorker, and he sent me these lovely photos of his mother and his sister, and they were so beautiful. I said, oh, these photos are so beautiful. Maybe I could use one on the cover of like the next edition of Wayward Lives. And he said, well, I really love your book. I wouldn't want people to think that my mother and my aunt are wayward. So those concerns live on.
Eu achei muito sensível.
Well, I really related to one of your observations in the book, which is, has to do with the following. White morality saw the way of living of the Black people, such as, an extended parenthood or many people living in one small house together, it was oftentimes seen as promiscuous and carelessness, when actually, in fact, it was an expression of the generosity of the poor. And maybe this is something that might make a lot of sense for people in Brazil who have to live together with their family members, relatives. They share the same spaces. And especially at times like these, with the economic downturn, people, they actually uh, try to help each other, and they, you know, are living together, sharing spaces. So you have many different Black people living in a tenement in a small room. That is bad for health. It is a health risk, a hazard. It's not seen as, a support system. Or maybe a family condition. It's not the bourgeois family, because we do not have money to be the bourgeois family, or we're not interested in being. So it's an interesting point as well in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I try to think of those things as resources for survival, right? I mean, it was important to have like a number of working people in the house, just literally to keep people alive. I mean, these 19th century reformers, they did, like all these kinds of studies, and literally most Black people did not make enough money to buy the amount of food that was required, the number of calories that were required to reproduce life every day. I mean, so that's a staggering admission, right? Like, so even the conditions of social reproduction are beyond what one can achieve. So why wouldn't you live collectively? I mean, they've done these studies, and they've actually demonstrated again and again, the poor are more generous than the rich. They have smaller incomes, they give more of it away than those who are wealthy, right? So rather than, thinking about this is like a disordered household, what would happen if just like more households were opened up? What if we weren't thinking about like our own nuclear unit as, the unit whose survival alone that we were dedicated to, but we start thinking at the level of the block or the community. And I think that those are, aspects of the lives of, poor folks that are inventive, right? That's part of like the brilliance of survival. Like, how do you make a way out of no way? And people are trying to figure that out every single day.
Bom, eu acho que
Well, I think that maybe, we have to adjourn now after these beautiful words, and we are, of course, invited to continue thinking, reflecting about these important matters. And I would say that, well, maybe if I have time to ask one last question, how would you say your work can contribute to broadening the idea Black people have, which represent freedom?
That's a very difficult last question. It's a very difficult last question. I mean, I tend to think about freedom, as a practice more than it is, even as a philosophy, as a practice, as an aspiration, and some people say like, that the whole Western project of freedom has been so fraught, that what it has produced, has been the opposite of freedom. But I think that for those of us who have these long histories of enslavement, I mean, I just feel for me, like freedom is an ideal that I can't let go of. And, but, its test is an everyday practice. Its test is, not being available for servitude. Its test is, challenging domination and oppression and exploitation wherever we encounter it. So, I think that there are other notions that might also organize a certain set of transformative aspirations, but as you know, the child of the enslaved, freedom will always be sweet for me, even as it is elusive.
Bom, então eu acho que
Well, then with this final reflection on freedom as a practice, I believe we can adjourn. I would say freedom is a topic that, well, we could all reflect more upon, especially in times like these, when the far right and fascism seek to, impact this idea of freedom by repressing others. And when we think about actually freedom in terms of more complex and subtle ideas, just as we said earlier, there are things that transform Black lives for the better, and other people also feel the benefits of that. It will bring about change that will reverberate at many levels. Thank you very much, Professor Hartmann, for joining us and for sharing your ideas, your very inspiring ideas. Thank you for your books, and I hope all the participants are more eager now to read your books. I would also like to greet everyone, to thank you, Professor Hartmann, a wholehearted thank you to you and to Stephanie Borges. Thank you to both for this panel. It is really, really enriching to all of us. We'll be back tomorrow at 4 p.m. with Noemi Jaff and Igor Heiner. Carla Rodriguez will also be talking to us about literature and mourning, and Fabiana Moraes and Marco Queiroz will also join us to talk about the idea of independence in a year when we celebrate 200 years of independence. So we'll be waiting for you. Thank you so much. Good evening, and see you next time.
Foi?